Hey everyone, Kevin here. I just went through 2 hours and 43 minutes of all of the testimony from Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin and Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell with the Senate Banking Committee so that we could get insights and all the bottom lines in one simple place here on what we should expect for the next stimulus package, some updates regarding the current stimulus package, like the EIDL, the PPP, ideas about tax cuts and stimulus, and talk about the economy. So let's just get right into it and give you the bottom lines. Oh, and by the way, if you want something to do while you listen to me break all of these fun facts down about tax cuts and the next stimulus plan and the things that are coming up and talking about debt and inflation, make sure to use this time wisely. Get 2 free stocks with Webull when you deposit $100. And of course, sign up for life insurance, because if you're like many of us who are wondering like, I know I need life insurance, but I don't know what to get. Go to the link down below, see how much it's gonna cost you to have, a $100,000 policy, $500K policy, $1 million policy. They're issuing these policies during the pandemic, which I think is crazy, but okay, check it out. And, shop later, but at least have something. All right, folks, let's get into the content. We start with Senator Brown, a Democrat. He rails on these guys and starts off with, look, essential workers are getting left behind. We want money in workers' pocket. It doesn't appear that this administration or the Federal Reserve are making workers their priority. And so he continues on with this and goes, what do you think about this essentially? Is it fair that essential workers are getting paid so little, Treasury Secretary? Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin kind of diverted an answer on this. And to this, Jerome Powell says, hey, look, we're doing all the things we can to create conditions to get people back to work. And he mentions, hey, what we need is pandemic pay for workers. You're giving trillions of dollars to corporations. How many people should die to raise the GDP or the Dow Jones 1,000 points? Just somewhat of a slam on Trump here, because Trump frequently refers to, oh, the Dow's up 1,000 points. We're doing great. Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin to this says, well, I was in Senate this morning with a mask. I assure you we're following the best medical advice. And the senator cuts him off and says, I'm not going to let you make a political statement. I'm like, oh, this is starting out kind of interesting for a hearing, but okay. So then we go to Senator Pat Toomey, a Republican, and he tries to kind of take what Jerome Powell said last week out of context here. Jerome Powell, remember, last week says that he thinks Congress needs to do more and that we need to be aggressive to support the economy and prevent long-lasting damage. Pat Toomey here says, well, I think Chairman Powell, when he said that Congress needs to do more, I think he means that we need a more nuanced approach, that we need to be mindful of our spending. Do you still stand by your original comment, Chairman Jerome Powell? And Powell responds with, I do. Would you like me to expand, Senator? And I think Jerome Powell's kind of catching on like, I'm about to contradict you. Do you want me to keep going here? And Pat Toomey is like, I think we've covered that, so let's move on. It starts talking about hospitals, and I'm like, oh, that's pretty big, because that's a big signal right here that Jerome Powell is, and I'm not suggesting that he's like pro-Democrat or pro-Republican, but it seems pretty clear that Jerome Powell's pro us spending more money. And Pat Toomey tried to basically bait Jerome Powell into saying, yeah, let's be mindful of our spending. We can wait and see. And Jerome Powell's like, that's not what I believe. I stand by what I said, that Congress needs to do more. Do you want me to expand? Oh, no, that's okay. So it's pretty clear what we've got, right? Democrats and the Federal Reserve going, more stimulus, help the economy. The presidential cabinet going, hey, we're open to more checks, but let's wait and see. Treasury Secretary, let's wait and see. And Republicans, we got to be mindful of spending. Okay, let's keep going on here to see what we've got. For example, Jack Reed, a Democrat, says the unemployment insurance programs will end. They've got an ending date here coming up. Do you think it's important to extend these or have like stabilizers where unemployment insurance payments automatically get made if we're at a certain level of unemployment, like this pandemic unemployment assurance or insurance payments program, that's $600 per week program that's expiring? And Jerome Powell says, well, I will say that long periods of unemployment can really affect people's ability to go back to work. Anything that helps keep people intact, hopefully their job, but in the meantime, keep them out of insolvency, aka bankruptcy, those are appropriate things to look at. So Jerome's like, hey, yeah, I mean, like, it's really a question for the fiscal authorities, aka Congress, but yeah, extending unemployment is an appropriate thing to look at. Okay. Then Jack Reed goes on to say, hey, look, unless we have a fiscal program that provides resources so that people can basically keep making their mortgage payments and paying their rent, aka more stimulus relief, what's going to happen is people aren't going to make their payments. And then he says, quote, that'll put pressure on the mortgage community, and you and the Fed and the Treasury will rush in, Wall Street will get help, and Main Street won't, aka the people won't get help. And Jerome Powell says, I think you're right. Waves of foreclosure can undermine household finances. So in this case, we have significant forbearance. That's something to continue. And he kind of suggests how important it is to have, this forbearance program kind of continue and sort of support again. So Jerome Powell really sort of reiterating here. And we're going to get to some other things here that start getting a little juicy as well. So we got Senator Menendez, a Democrat, who says, look, if states and counties continue to lay off employees from, an economic point of view, doesn't that make the economic recovery worse? And Jerome Powell says, essentially, yes. We have evidence from the great financial crisis or the global financial crisis, the GFC, that the years after where state and local layoffs happened and a lack of hiring happened, and that these things weighed on the economy. So this is interesting because Jerome Powell is saying, look, it's not just layoffs. It's not just people getting laid off, not having their job to go back to, which remember, 91% of people who are getting laid off think they have a job to go back to. Yet research shows that 42% of them won't have a job to go back to, which is bad. And it's not just layoffs, though. It's also companies not hiring as much. And that's really going to weigh on the economy. And so this is where you can clearly see Jerome suggesting again, hey, we've got to focus on propping this economy up. Now, we'll talk about debt in a moment because obviously that comes up. And it's a substantial and reasonable question. What about debt? What about inflation? That'll come up in just a moment. So then we get into here, we've got Senator Elizabeth Warren. She gets a little feisty here with Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin. At first, she starts with, can you speak about the long-term scars if we don't take aggressive action? Jerome Powell says there's clear evidence of that. It could be permanent and weigh on the economy for large, equally with small and medium businesses. It could, quote, destroy the work of families and generations. That is, if basically Congress and the government don't do enough, if we do too little, if we undershoot the recovery, we don't have enough stimulus, you're destroying what families have built and people have worked for generations. When she points or starts hitting on Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin, she starts off with, Steve Mnuchin, you said the jobs numbers will improve, better in the third quarter, better in the fourth quarter, and next year is going to be a great year. Remember, this is very typical of sort of the political filter that we hear. Both sides have the political filter, of course. But anyway, does this mean you'll require companies to keep workers on payroll? This is actually, in my opinion, a reasonable question. She's like, hey, if y'all gonna bail out companies, are you gonna make the companies keep people employed? And I kind of get both POVs. Like, that makes sense. That seems reasonable. If you're going to get bailouts, like what's happening in the United Kingdom or Germany, where the government's coming in saying, hey, look, we'll pay 80% of everybody's payroll. Just don't fire anybody. Don't lay off anybody. Well, the U.S. is totally the opposite. The U.S. is like, Uber lay off 3,000 people. Oh, we'll lay off thousands of people over here. Oh, United Airlines. Oh, we'll shift, thousands of people to part-time employment from full-time employment. It's like at the drop of a hat, companies can cut in America. And that is one of the things in a good economy that makes our country great, that sort of dynamicness that we have, but it's really bad in times like this. But I also get that the Treasury Department and governments, they don't want to be too restrictive with their loan programs. Although, if they're loose with big companies, why are they so restrictive with the PPP loan and small companies? It's kind of messed up. It's hard for small businesses to deal with the PPP loan, an 11-page forgiveness application. So, the whole thing's just a little bit messed up. But anyway, she goes on to say that, Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin responds and says, look, I said I think the numbers will get worse before they get better. June will be difficult, and it's our intent to fulfill everything, like all of our loan facilities, and follow the law and do what we're supposed to do. And she replies and says, no, that's not quite right. The law gives you, The Treasury, the specific authority to determine the terms at which these loans are made for corporations. So simple question. You say the economy will recover. That's going to take jobs. Are you going to require companies to keep people on payroll? Steve Mnuchin says, well, our number one objective is keeping people employed, and we negotiated restrictions on employee compensation, dividends, and buybacks, which, by the way, applies to like the executives and the big corporations, right? And in Main Street lending, we have a provision that people use their best efforts to support jobs. This is where she rails right into him. Wait, what you're saying? No requirements for payroll in any facility except in Main Street lending? And there you have a commercial, reasonable effort to be able to maintain jobs? So basically, corporations can fire a bunch of people, or it doesn't work out commercially and then they can fire people. So I take it your answer to my question is no. That is, the Treasury doesn't require people or corporations not fire people if they take bailouts, essentially. And Treasury Secretary goes on, well, we kind of talked about this with people on both, and he kind of diverts. Like, this is what Democrats and Republicans decided. I don't blame him for that response. He got put into a really hard spot there because that doesn't look good. So, then she says, look, you're in charge of $500 billion and this was harsh, okay? You're in charge of $500 billion and you're boosting your Wall Street buddies and you're leaving America behind. Whew. To that he says, I think that's a very unfair characterization. These issues were discussed, blah, blah, blah. Okay, interesting. It kind of just shows this divisiveness, which just a heads up, this divisiveness, it's not good, okay? That's not really good for the next stimulus package. So what else do we have here? Then Senator Perdue, a Republican, this is about debt. This is fascinating too. He goes, look, before the crisis, we were able to roll down the Fed's balance sheet from $5 trillion to $3.8 trillion. Now we're at $7 trillion today, and it could go north of $14 trillion. How do you put this genie back in the bottle? How do you pay off the debt? How confident are you that we can handle this? To which Jerome Powell says, well, over time, this debt will roll off and we'll basically pay it off over time. And Jerome Powell clarifies that what matters is the size of the balance sheet relative to the economy. So basically just saying, oh, it's $7 trillion. It doesn't mean much. It has to be related to the size of the economy. And he says, look, before Jerome came in, the balance sheet was at about 25% debt to the size of the economy. They reduced it to about 16 to 17%. Well, now it's obviously ballooning. Our GDP's just over $20 trillion. So if we had $7 trillion in essentially debt or balance sheet debt with the Fed, well, then that means we're at about 35% debt to the size of our economy, which is obviously larger than we started with. But what was really fascinating is he says right now, in the meantime, quote, it doesn't have implications to inflation or financial stability concerns today. In time, yes. So that's actually very good. Jerome Powell is saying, hey, look, in terms of the debt and inflation, you don't have to be worried about that right now. We can't do this forever. In time, it'll get paid off, but now's not the time to worry about the debt. So we're continually getting this sort of reiteration from Jerome Powell. Don't worry about the debt. We got the money. We have the capacity to spend. We got to prevent avoidable bankruptcies. We got to help the people. We need more stimulus. Okay, let's keep going on here. So then we get Senator Schatz says that, look, half of small businesses are going to run out of cash in a month. Do you see enough of a rebound to prevent thousands of businesses from going under? Jerome Powell says, we're going to see very quickly how the reopening goes. Basically, no one knows until we kind of get the data. But yeah, we have to be prepared to do more. This is good. Another sign from Jerome Powell that, hey, we're ready to go. And he also indicates that Congress needs to be ready to go too, and the Treasury needs to be ready to go to help. To this, Senator Tom Tillis, a Republican, actually says, hey, what about a reduction of the tax burden, tax cuts for middle-class households? And Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin says, I think that's something that should seriously be considered. That's interesting because this is really the first time we've heard Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin come from the angle of, yeah, let's do tax breaks. Let's help. I mean, we've heard of payroll tax cut and things like that, but reduction of tax burden for middle-class households, That's a big one. That's a nice reveal right here. Then we get to Senator John Kennedy, a Republican, who says he thinks there's less than a 50% chance that this bill is going to pass. And then Kyrsten Sinema, a Democrat, comes in and says, hey, look, I sent you, Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin, a letter that, remember the EIDL program that was supposed to give people, like small businesses, over half of people who have side hustles and small businesses, $10,000 within 3 business days of applying? Why did the SBA reduce that to $1,000 per employee? We want the full $10,000 per person who applies or per business that applies. And so she kind of rails him on that, which it's nice to see pressure on the EIDL still, which Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin calls idle, which I guess if you say EIDL, it's idle, but okay. So it's nice to see that pressure, but Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin kind of goes, yeah, I'll follow up on that. So no real answers on that. But hey, there's some big things in here. I mean, we're talking tax cuts as something that was mentioned with the Treasury Department. We're clearly seeing a substantial support from Jerome Powell for the economy. He's saying we don't have to be worried about debt or inflation right now. We don't have to be worried about financial stability. And overall, there's your summary of this meeting. So if you like my kind of insights and summaries, make sure to hit subscribe. Also check out my programs, link below. Use that coupon code. Get your life insurance. Get your 2 free stocks with Webull when you deposit $100. And folks, we'll see you next time.